Good evening and welcome to our public meeting. My name is Brenda Boston. I'm this year's president of the League of Women Voters for Richardson. The purpose of this meeting tonight is it's an educational tool to help citizens make informed decision on the ballot box, at the ballot box in November. November the 3rd is election. The League is not advocating for or against any proposition on the ballot. If you're interested in joining the League, Susan, where are you? Susan's right over here, and she'll be glad to talk to you and explain about the League. And if you're interested in joining, it is open to women and men of all ages. So we welcome you. And tonight's forum is being videotaped. You can see Ivy right here. And we hope that the video will be available by Saturday on our website, which is www.LWV-Richardson, and you can go there to see a copy of this. The League of Women Voters of Richardson has prepared a voter's guide for this election. And I just have to have an aside because the ladies who worked on this are community volunteers and they spent many hours preparing this. So they've done a wonderful job on it. They're available on the back table if you need them. They're also available on our website. As I say, all of the people who worked on this are community volunteers, and our goal is to provide voters with information to help you vote responsibly. To prepare the voters' guides, the League members looked at each of the 83 ballot propositions about the city charter, and they looked at two things. What will change if this proposition passes? How much impact will this change have on city government if this proposition passes? The volunteers organized each of the propositions into one of three categories. 3-star propositions, if passed, would have a major impact on the way the city conducts its business. 2-star propositions, if passed, may have some impact on the way the city conducts its business. 1-star propositions, if passed, will likely have little impact on the way the city conducts business. This evening, our moderator is Sandy Grayson. She's the past president of the League of Women Voters of Dallas. She was there from 2009 to 2011. Since 2011, she served on the Dallas City Council for District 12, has been vice chair of the Quality of Life and Environment Committee, and has been a member of the Public Safety Committee and the Transportation and Trinity River Project Committee. Councilman Grayson has also served on the Dallas City Council from 1997 to 2005. Please help me welcome Sandy Grayson.
Thank you, Brenda. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start off by reviewing the format of the meeting tonight. This is how we're going to conduct the meeting. First, please silence your pagers and cell phones, and flash photography is not allowed during the meeting because it distracts the speakers. If you have a question to ask the panelists, please write it on a card. If you need a card, please raise your hand. Hello, former Mayor Slagle. Please raise your hand at any time and a teller will bring you a card. Put only one question on the card and please write it clearly so the screeners can read it. Your question may be addressed to either or both of our speakers. Questions submitted by email prior to tonight have been transcribed to the cards and will be given the same consideration as those submitted tonight. When you have written a question on the card, raise your hand and a teller will deliver your card to the screener's table. The question screeners are seated at this table beside me. They're volunteers from the League of Women Voters of Richardson. The screeners are grouping questions by topic to avoid repetition and inappropriate content. They'll screen the questions according to League of Women Voters of Texas Guide to Candidate Forums. Questions may be combined or edited for clarity. Our speakers tonight are Dr. Robert Lowry and Dr. Matthew Wilson. Dr. Lowry is a professor in the political science program of the School of Economic, Political, and Policy Sciences at the University of Texas at Dallas. Dr. Wilson is associate professor of political science in the Dedman College of Humanities and Sciences at Southern Methodist University. A short biography of each of these gentlemen is in your program. So let's begin the discussion with Dr. Lowry giving a short overview of home rule charters. Dr. Lowry?
Thank you. I don't know if you need the mic or not. Home rule is a concept that's used, I think, in pretty much every state in the Union. Under the Texas Constitution, municipalities with less than 5,000 population are governed by the general laws of the state and the Constitution. Those with more than 5,000 population can adopt their own charter for how they want to structure their council, their elections, various duties and obligations, provided it is not precluded by the Constitution or the statutes of the state. And preclusion could mean either an explicit prohibition or just that they say do something specific and, so you have to comply with that. So, the basic idea is general law municipalities can only do what the state law tells them they can do. Home rule municipalities can do what they want, provided the state law tells them they can't.
Well, thank you. That was very crisp and to the point. Dr. Wilson will discuss the consequences, if any, of replacing specific requirements or limitations in the current city charter with language such as to the extent allowed by the Texas Constitution and laws. Dr. Wilson?
The basic thing to be aware of here is that, and Professor Lowry alluded to this, that the city has authority under a home rule charter to set some of its own regulations, but those can't conflict with state law. State law is supreme. So if state law prohibits something, then the city can't do it. If state law mandates something, the city can't choose not to do it. What the city can do is, if it wishes, go beyond where the state goes in regulating some sort of behavior. So, for example, a city could choose to have, let's say, a fireworks ordinance that is neither mandated nor prohibited by state law. That would be at the discretion of the municipality. But what the charter does make clear is that its provisions are only valid to the extent that they're consistent with the laws and Constitution of the state of Texas, which, even if the city didn't say that, it would still be the case because that is Texas state law, and that applies to all municipalities with the home rule charter or otherwise.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. We're now going to begin discussion of the 3 star propositions that Brenda mentioned to you, where the league felt that those were the most, the ones that would have the greatest impact. So we'll do it in numeric order by proposition number. For each of these propositions, one of the panelists was designated by the Richardson League as the lead panelist. He will begin the discussion by summarizing what the changes will be if the proposition passes, followed by a discussion of what impact, positive or negative, passage of the proposition will have on the city. The other panelists may add to what the lead panelist said. And I'll go ahead and read the proposition and tell you which of the panelists will be addressing it first. The first one is proposition number 3, which is about the city council. Shall section 3.07 of the charter be amended to provide that a vacancy in the office of mayor shall be filled by special election, and the provisions of section 3.03 of the charter providing for the mayor pro tem to assume the office of mayor in the event of a vacancy in the office of the mayor be repealed. Dr. Lowry?
Okay, so propositions 3 and 4 really go together. They're both amending section 3.07 of the current charter, and it is to provide, in my view, it seems to me that proposition 3 really is sort of the lead proposition, because it says under the current charter, if the mayor, if there's a vacancy for the mayor, it's filled by the council, whereas under the proposition, if you have a vacancy for mayor, it's filled by special election. And so the basic issue is, well, is that desirable or not? And one thing I would, if I were a voter voting on this, and I tried to sort of think about these things a little bit this way, one problem with special elections is they cost money. I have no idea how much a special election costs. 5,000, 500,000, that would seem to be a relevant piece of information. Another thing we do know, though, about special elections is not many people show up. And so, so the question is, would you want the mayor to be chosen by the council, the interim mayor, until there can be another general election, chosen by the existing council members, or chosen by, whatever very small subset of the voters choose to show up at a special election? Another issue as to whether, how important is it that even an interim mayor be directly responsive to the voters or accountable to the voters? And that, again, that's a judgment call. And it also, it seems to me, depends on some of the other propositions here. One point I wanted to make is there's 83 propositions here. And that's because of something called the single subject rule, which again is something that, as far as I know, every state that allows direct democracy has. And direct democracy basically just means that provisions whereby voters can vote directly on legislation, or constitutional amendments, or amendments to the city charter, or what have you. But it basically says that each amendment can only deal with a single subject. And that's sort of one reason for that, is that so people can't sort of bundle up good ideas and bad ideas and get the bad ideas through by having people vote on the good ideas. And also if you combine a bunch of proposals, that might create a lot of confusion. But the problem it creates is that you vote on each one of these 83 amendments individually. And I didn't even try to do the math to figure out the permutations for how many different combinations might pass and fail. And it may well be that in some cases, whether Proposition A is a good idea, it depends on whether Proposition B passes. And in those cases, you just try to sort of figure out, and maybe lobby your friends to vote for both of them or neither, or something like that. But so on Proposition 3, how important it is that the interim mayor be directly accountable or directly elected by the voters depends to some extent on how powerful the mayor's office is, it seems to me. Now it seems to be largely ceremonial. There are some other propositions in here that would make it more substantive. So again, do you think those are going to pass or not? But on the other hand, it's for those who wonder, well, do we really have to vote for an interim mayor? I was thinking, so what's the most powerful political office in the world? The United States president. The last time we had an interim United States president, or someone who was selected in the middle of the term, was Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford was not voted into any national office. He'd been elected as a congressman from Grand Rapids. Ended up becoming president because first Spiro Agnew resigned as vice president, and then Richard Nixon resigned as president. When Gerald Ford became president, he was replaced by Nelson Rockefeller, who at the time did not hold any political office and had been a former governor of New York. And the country managed to go through 2.5 years with Ford and Rockefeller as president and vice president. So, again, ultimately it kind of comes down to, it seems to me, sort of two things. One is, given the powers of the mayor, how important do you really feel it is for an interim mayor who will be subject to a general election within 2 years to be directly elected by the voters? And then on a much more nuts and bolts level, how much does a special election cost? And how much are you willing to spend to have that direct electoral responsiveness?
Thank you, Doctor. We'll go to Proposition number 4, which is also about the City Council. Shall Section 3.07 of the Charter be amended to provide that vacancies in the office of the 6 council members, not including the mayor, be filled by special election when there are 2 or more vacancies of the 6 council members other than the mayor, without amending the provision that allows the City Council to fill by appointment a single vacancy in the office of council member other than mayor. Dr. Lowry?
Yes, so this, again, it seems to me, is kind of follows on from Proposition 3. If you're going to say that we will now fill a vacancy for mayor by an election, you sort of have to change the current provisions for filling council vacancies, because it refers to 3 vacancies for council and this sort of thing. So this would sort of bring that back in line and say, okay, setting the mayor aside, now we've got 2 or more council members then we have an election. Otherwise, the council can select their replacements. But here again, this brings up the issue of the single amendment, or single issue. Because right now, section 3.07 has no subsections. It's just one paragraph that deals with replacing vacancies on the council, including the mayor. You would be voting on separately on propositions 3 and 4, which create two subsections, and striking the entirety of the current paragraph. My question is, what happens to the current paragraph if one of the proposals passes and the other one fails? I think you'd have to ask your attorney. I don't want to venture a guess. My suggestion would be vote for both of them or neither of them. Because it's fairly clear that Proposition 4 is intended to sort of say, okay, if we're going to elect the interim mayor, then how do we, adjust the language for filling the rest of the council seats?
Dr. Wilson, would you like to comment on either of these propositions?
Just quickly, with regard to the provisions for replacing a mayor if there's a vacancy in the mayor's office, just to put this in context historically, it's important to remember that until relatively recently, the people of Richardson never voted directly on the mayor, right? This is an innovation in city politics. So it's not as if this would represent some sort of radical, unprecedented step if a vacancy were to be filled without direct input from the voters. So there certainly was a tradition in Richardson of trusting the judgment of the council members to choose a reasonable and responsible mayor. In this case, it would only come into play if there were to be an unexpected vacancy in the mayoral office. Obviously, that person would then still have to come before the voters to win a full term at the next election time. So it's just worth pointing out that this, it's not some sort of dramatic step away from democracy. It simply goes along with what had been the custom in the past. So even for normal mayoral elections.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Before we go to proposition number 5, clarification needs to be made. On page 4 of the Richardson League's Voters Guide, the last bullet in the analysis portion states, if this proposition passes, citizens will be expressly prohibited from speaking at emergency meetings or authorized closed meetings of the City Council. Yesterday it was pointed out that this statement may not be accurate, so the Richardson League requested clarification from the city attorney. His response is, if Proposition 5 is approved, the council is not required to allow citizens to speak in an emergency meeting, but may do so if the council desires. As for authorized closed meetings, which are executive sessions, under state law, the public is not allowed to attend or speak during an authorized closed meeting. So proposition number 5 is again about the city council. Shall section 3.10 of the charter relating to meetings of the city council being open to the public be amended to clarify that, except for emergency called meetings and authorized closed meetings, it is the meetings of the city council which are open to the public, at which citizens are allowed by the rules of the city council to be heard in regard to any matter considered at such meetings. Dr. Lowry?
So this proposal has to do with the basic notion of government in the sunshine, which is the idea that in a democracy, the government business should be done in the open where it can be seen. And so there's the State Public Meetings Act, which again I think every state in the country has one, that basically says that the regular meetings of government bodies must be open to the public. And then in addition, the current proposal says that meetings, the current charter says that meetings of the city council, where's the language here? 3.10. Meetings of the city council and all committees thereof shall be open to the public except as otherwise permitted by state law. Whether citizens need to speak at the meetings is actually a separate question. I mean, you can achieve many of the objectives of government in sunshine simply by having the meeting open, so that the deals aren't being done, behind closed doors, and people can see. And if people object, there's ample time to notify the press and raise it as an issue in the next election and object, or just having citizen input, of course, number one, allows people to object on the spot, and number two, to provide what may be valuable information. So there's good reason to do that, but the basic notion of public meetings basically requires that they be public, not that people necessarily be able to participate. Again, if you think of U.S. Congress, you can sit up in the gallery and watch what goes on whenever they happen to be in session, but you're not allowed to, participate in the debates from up in the spectators gallery. And so that, that's the way Congress works. So this would clarify some language. Closed meetings, again, by state statute, they're by definition closed. So people can neither observe nor participate, and there are specific criteria set out in the statute for when you can close a meeting, things having to do with like personnel matters and other things that you generally want to deal with out of the glare of public light. Emergency meetings, again, with sort of clarification, is it would be at the option of the council. And if it's an emergency, they may want to just get it done fast. But again, the interpretation is it would be at their option, and so they could invite conversation if they felt it would be useful, either in terms of getting useful information or just from a political standpoint of making people feel that they had a chance to participate. Because often in taking action, and especially taking action in times of crisis, it's important that not only that you do the right thing, but that people see that you did it the right way. And so giving people a chance to have their voices heard, is one way to achieve that end. One question I have about the proposal is this language in the current charter about committees thereof. There is no mention in the new language about committees. So I'm not quite sure what that means, if committees are just, again, sort of at the discretion of the committee or not, but I would point out that they're not mentioned at all either way in the new language.
Thank you, Dr. Lowry. Dr. Wilson?
Right, and just following on that real quick, which could then be interpreted to mean that, excuse me, that the language as it governs meetings of the full council, if this proposal is adopted, no longer applies in the same way to committees that the full council might create. So that is, if there are provisions governing citizens speaking before the council, as the charter currently reads, whatever provisions apply with regard to that also apply with regards to citizens speaking before any committee of the council. If this provision is adopted, it seems that those two could now be separable. Is that your understanding as well? That's no longer the same, would no longer necessarily be the same rules that govern citizens speaking before the full council as opposed to citizens speaking before the committee. That being said, as Dr. Lowry pointed out, the council certainly still could welcome public input even at an emergency meeting. As we got this important clarification, they would in no way be prohibited from doing so. But if they felt that it was important to just move quickly through the business in an emergency meeting, they could, for example, decide that there was not going to be public input at the meeting. But nothing would preclude people from contacting their council people outside of the meeting time. It doesn't foreclose communication between constituents and members of the council. It could conceivably just foreclose that communication back and forth at the actual meeting itself.
Thank you, Dr.
Yeah,
Wilson.
good. Well, just one more point on committees. As far as whether they are open to the public, they'd still be subject to the state public meetings rule.
Okay, we'll go now to proposition number 8, which is about the city manager. Shall section 6.01 of the charter relating to the terms of appointment of the city manager by the city council be amended to clarify that the city manager, who under the current charter is appointed without a fixed period of time, is accountable to the city council for the proper administration of the city and eliminating inconsistent language. Dr. Lowry?
Well, I think when it comes to accountability, it's good to have consistent language and good to have it clear. And I think especially as the mayor's office is becoming more distinct, it's a good, this language would try to clarify exactly who the manager is accountable to. And it says the city manager shall be accountable to the council for the proper administration of the city. So that would, again, sort of try to make sure that as we're sort of carving out the separate role for the mayor, that we still know that the manager reports to the council. And so that seems, again, just to try to make things clear so that we know who's running things.
Dr. Wilson?
Well, one of the significant effects of this provision speaks to the potential length of a contract term for the city manager, which right now is stipulated to be not in excess of 2 years. And if this provision passes, there would be no reference in the charter to how long the city manager's contract might be for. One could imagine advantages to the city from this flexibility for the council in trying to hire a city manager or come to an agreement with the city manager, that if the council has the flexibility to offer a longer contract, that might enhance the attractiveness of the position to a desirable candidate. So that's one potential argument in favor of creating that flexibility. Now, the trade-off there is that if a longer contract is in fact offered, it could potentially mean that, or it would mean that not every council explicitly has to review and renew the contract of the city manager. So, that's what voters can weigh here, is the trade-off from that flexibility given to the council to offer a longer contract and thus potentially to have a more attractive bargaining position with a candidate versus the necessity to have repeated renewal, review, accountability for the city manager. That's kind of the trade-off.
Thank you. Let's go to proposition number 13, which is about budget and financial procedure. Shall section 11.07 of this charter be amended to clarify that the prohibition of the transfer of funds of any non-tax supported city public utility does not apply to the transfer of budgeted funds of any non-tax supported city public utility or other enterprise fund for purposes of reimbursing the general fund for providing administrative services to such operations. Dr. Wilson?
As I read this provision, this is largely about accounting. This would refer to the transfer of funds between different pools within the budget, largely as a reimbursement mechanism. That is, sometimes the city might provide out of its general fund, pay out of its general fund for services that support the operations of, as stipulated here, a non-tax supported public utility, and then want to be reimbursed for its provision of those services. This change would allow that to happen, right? It would allow for those funds to be shifted to reimburse the city general fund for those services that it might provide in support of those activities. Currently, with the way the charter is written, that is not an accounting move that can take place. So, as I read this, that would be the intent behind this change, whether you support that accounting flexibility given to the city or not.
Dr. Lauer, would you like to comment?
Yeah, one comment on this is, so the idea of charging the utility for administrative services, that seems fairly commonsensical. There could be a difficulty, and I don't know if this has come up in the past, of calculating just how much the value of those services is, because this is what economists call joint costs. Typically, when you have an administrative unit that oversees a bunch of operating units, there are many things the administrative unit does that aren't necessarily clearly assigned to one unit or other, but which benefit the whole. They benefit all of the units operating under the city, and so I frankly don't know if that's an issue that's come up, if there've been disputes over the amount of the costs that have been transferred here, or if it's simply a question of whether it's reasonable for the utility to reimburse the city. But that's something that would have. I would think if I were the utility, I would want to have the formula spelled out for exactly how you're going to calculate these things.
Thank you, gentlemen. Let's go to proposition number 16 about issuance and sale of bonds. Shall section 19.04 of the charter be repealed and sections 19.01 and 19.02 of the charter relating to the issuance of bonds be amended to simplify and clarify the authority of the city to issue and sell bonds in accordance with state law? Dr. Wilson?
This is, of course, this speaks to one of the most significant ways that the city has of raising money for long-term projects, for various things that it wants to fund, which is the issuance of bonds. Really, the question at issue here is whether or not the people of the city want to grant greater flexibility to city government, place greater trust in city government to make responsible decisions with regard to bond issuance. Because this provision does liberalize the rules that govern that bond issuance. So, for example, one of the issues involved is whether to eliminate a restriction on the city's level of indebtedness. Okay, so that now the city is constrained that it cannot undertake total indebtedness of more than 15% of the assessed value of taxable property. This provision would remove that restriction and allow the city, if it so chose, to go beyond that level of indebtedness. Now, it's important to point out that they still couldn't go beyond that level of indebtedness without the bonds actually being approved at an election by the voters. So, this doesn't remove public control over bond issuance. So if people in the city were concerned that the city was taking on too much debt, that could become an issue in the bond election, and people could vote down the bonds. That's still an option that would remain. But the city, if this provision were adopted, would no longer be prohibited from even proposing bonds that might take it above that level of indebtedness. So it increases the level of flexibility in terms of what could be proposed, but would leave the ultimate determination about whether the bond is approved or not, of course, in the hands of voters.
Dr. Lowry?
This, and I think there are actually a number of proposals here which would strip away specific restrictions in the current charter and basically say that the council is free to do whatever is allowed up to the maximum allowed by the state laws of Texas and the Constitution. And somewhat, maybe a little ironically, it's sort of using your home rule power to say, well, we're not going to be home rule, we're just going to operate under Texas state laws. But, so be it. If that's the better option, so be it. But I agree with Dr. Wilson entirely that the basic, it sort of comes down to, in that sense, how much trust do you want to put in the council, given that ultimately there's always some sort of an electoral check, either on the specific issue like a bond, or on reelecting the council or not, depending on whether you think that they have used that authority wisely. The other comment I would make specifically on bonds is that restrictions on the issuance of bonds at the state and local level are actually quite common throughout the country. And there is some research, some of which I've actually done, that basically shows that, this is state research that I've done, but it seems logical that it would follow at the municipal level. States that have more restrictions on their ability to issue bond debt have better bond ratings and generally pay a slightly lower interest rate. So, and that's just the sort of the rule that says you can't even propose it to the voters. You just can't do it. Possible for me to say how much of a difference that might make. I don't even know what Richardson's current bond rating is, but the markets tend to sort of view those things somewhat favorably.
Thank you. Let's go to proposition number 17, which is a general provision. Shall section 21.02 of the charter relating to the execution of contracts be amended to simplify and clarify that the mayor, city manager, or designee of the city manager may execute contracts without being attested to by the city secretary, consistent with the city administrative code, and eliminate city council approval of plans and specifications for public improvements consistent with state law. Dr. Lowry?
Okay, so this is actually the proposal I had in mind when I was saying that whether you think an interim mayor needs to be elected may have something to do with how much power and authority the mayor has. Right now, again, the mayor's office is somewhat, ceremonial, but this would give the mayor authority to sign contracts, which he or she does not currently have. So if you think this proposal is going to pass, then that increases the case, perhaps, for voting to have an interim mayor elected. Although, as I said before, we had a president of the United States interim who was never elected, so it's not an absolute in that direction. But my question in sort of reading this is what problem does this solve? I mean, have there been contracts in the past that the city was unable to enter into because the mayor wasn't authorized to sign them? I mean, and if not, then I'm not entirely sure what the pro argument is here, other than, again, to sort of increase the overall power of the mayor's office, which may be, I mean, you may want a stronger executive in general, and if you do, stronger executives need to have some powers. But I look at this and I'm not sure what the problem is it's supposed to solve.
Dr. Wilson?
Yeah, I don't really have.
Okay, all right. Proposition number 19 is about the effective date and effects of adoption. Shall Article 22 be amended to add Section 22.05 of the Charter to require the City Council appoint a commission to review the Charter at least every 10 years? Dr. Lowry?
Okay, so this actually, notwithstanding the title of the proposition, has not much to do with effective dates. It would add an entirely new section to the charter, which requires, again, the council to appoint a commission to review the charter every 10 years. The notion that charters or foundational documents, constitutions, whatever you want to call them, should be reviewed periodically is something, again, that's been has a long history. Thomas Jefferson thought that we should renew the federal constitution about every 25 years. There are some states that actually have similar proposals to review the state, for the voters going to vote on whether to have a convention to review the entire state constitution every 16 years. Michigan, I'm familiar with, does that. So this would sort of implement that idea. There is, and of course we've had, we're here now because we had a commission that reviewed the charter and proposed a whole bunch of amendments. There's an issue that it does create, which is that under the Texas Local Government Code, there is a provision for the city governing body of a municipality to put a referendum to the voters of the municipality, asking them whether they should appoint a commission to recommend a new charter or to amend the charter. And then there is a separate section of the local government code that says the council itself can recommend amendments to the charter. There's no real provision that says that the council can appoint a commission to recommend amendments to the charter. However, there's where I think sort of home rule comes in. There's nothing that says you can't do it. So, that would seem to be consistent. I don't think it conflicts with that statute. The issue is sort of why have a commission? For one, what's the difference between having a commission propose an entirely new charter and recommending 83 separate amendments to the current charter? I mean, at some point, they kind of blur together. It seems left open to me as to exactly how the commission or the members of the council would choose the members of the commission. I mean, I don't know how that was done at this point either. The issue about appointed versus elected commissions comes down, I think, to the question of insiders and outsiders. I mean, if you have the current council appointing the commission that reviews the charter, they're likely to appoint people who are like them, who they know, who they network with. It doesn't really surprise me that this commission, which was appointed by the council, recommended that future commissions be appointed by the council. If you want to have a commission with people on it who have, non-majoritarian views, who are part of the minority, the out crowd, the breath of fresh air, whatever you want to call them, there needs to be some mechanism for doing that. On the other hand, that proposal isn't really on the ballot. But what we do have on the ballot is that anybody at any time can get a petition together and can amend the charter, which was how we got elected mayors in the first place, as I understand it. So where am I leading with this? Again, on the one level, there's simply the question of whether you want to mandate a regular review of the charter every 10 years. And then if you think that's a good idea, this is the only proposal on the ballot that would do that. And I think it would be an interesting question to see how it plays out in terms of how such a commission was actually chosen.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson.
Just quickly, the only thing I would add to that is, as a practical matter, as I understand it, the one real difference between proposing an entirely new charter and proposing, 83 or 183 or however many amendments to the current charter is the way that they would have to be voted on to be approved. If an entirely new charter were proposed, it could be voted on, as I understand it, in toto. That is, the people could vote up or down the new charter. Whereas because of the single subject rule, if you have amendments to the current charter, they've got to go, Amendment 1, Amendment 2, Amendment 3. So an entirely new charter, if one were ever crafted, would allow for, in effect, bundling, and for people then to vote on either approving it or rejecting it in toto, whereas amendments, you have to go, but that's really just a procedural concern. That's just a little add-on to the broader point that Dr. Lowry was making.
Actually, again, the local government code does say the charter commission shall prepare the charter so that to the extent practicable, each subject may be voted on separately.
How do we define that?
Again, that's sort of getting afield from what this proposal is. But yeah, that was exactly my first thought too, is, that's the difference. You can vote up or down on the whole thing, but apparently that's not the case. It may be that you can't split it up quite so finely if you have a charter commission proposing a new charter. But in any event, I think the main thing here is simply whether you want to mandate, a comprehensive review of the charter every 10 years, which will, I'm sure, cost a little bit of money. I'm not sure how they compensate people on these commissions, but buy their lunch or something. But the real question is whether it's just a good idea to do it every 10 years.
Thank you. Let's go to proposition number 22 about powers of the city. Shall section 2.03 of the charter be amended to clarify and simplify the existing charter language regarding the exercise of the power of eminent domain by the city as authorized by state law, and sections 18.01 and 18.02 of the charter be repealed to eliminate a redundancy with section 2.03 as amended? Dr. Wilson.
Okay, so finally we get to something that's a real hot button issue that gets people fired up, which is the question of eminent domain. Not to say that the city of Richardson is exercising eminent domain willy-nilly, but around the country, this is an issue that people get very exercised about. And so what's really at issue here is how many, if any, of the specific restrictions on the city's exercise of eminent domain do we, as voters in the city, want to remove? How much do we want to just bring the restrictions on the city's exercise of eminent domain in line with state level restrictions? Because that's what this would do. This would, if this provision were passed, then the limitations on how the city of Richardson could exercise eminent domain would be governed by restrictions that exist at the state level in Texas on the exercise of eminent domain, as opposed to, with the existing charter, an enumeration of the city can exercise eminent domain for this purpose or that purpose or a third purpose or a fourth purpose. Well, what I think is in the mind of the people proposing this provision is that, you couldn't necessarily imagine in advance every conceivable purpose for which the city might want to exercise eminent domain. So I think their idea is to give the city more flexibility by saying, as long as their exercise of eminent domain is consistent with state law, that it ought to be allowed. So, but that's what's at issue here, is whether people are comfortable with removing the specific enumerated list of purposes for which the city might exercise eminent domain, potentially to give it flexibility to deal with unforeseen circumstances where eminent domain might be desirable. But as some of you may know, this is a hugely controversial issue nationally. You may have heard of the Supreme Court decision of Kelo versus New Hampshire that got a lot of people very exercised about whether a city could exercise eminent domain in order to promote a private economic development in the interest of creating more jobs and economic activity in the city. That was certainly an expansion of how the eminent domain power had traditionally been understood. So I mean, that's where people get pretty exercised about this question, is to just how tightly should that exercise of power be limited.
Thank you. Dr. Lowry?
Yeah, the Kelo case really, I think, surprised a lot of people when it was decided. I mean, traditionally, eminent domain has been used for public purposes, which pretty much everybody assumed, and traditionally it always meant something owned by the public and used by the public. So you tear out a bunch of houses to put in a highway or a park or something. And in Kelo, they allowed the city to condemn some houses for the purpose of allowing another private developer to build, I think it was a shopping center. And the argument was that, well, it would generate more tax revenues and therefore it was serving a public purpose. And that really, is what really lit the fuse on eminent domain. And I honestly don't quite know what the Texas state restrictions are. Given the respect for property rights in Texas, I would doubt that that sort of eminent domain would be looked on favorably at the state level. But I really don't know. But yeah, I agree with Dr. Wilson. This is another one of those proposals that basically says, rather than having all these specifics in our charter, we're just going to go with what the state law says. And on the one hand, it means that if you have some need, some legitimate need that isn't explicitly spelled out in this list under the current charter, that you wouldn't be bound by that. But it also opens up the door to doing something that people would object to. So it sort of comes down to how much are you willing to trust the council, and not just the council, but in this case, the state of Texas, because everything has to take place within that framework.
Thank you, gentlemen. We'll go to proposition number 33 about the city attorney and municipal court. Shall section 7.01 of the charter regarding the appointment and duties of the city attorney be amended to provide greater flexibility to city council in relation to services provided by the city attorney, and repeal section 7.05 and 7.06 of the charter to delete language redundant or in conflict with the provisions of section 7.01 as amended? Dr. Lowry.
So this is another one of these sections where the current charter lays out a bunch of specific restrictions. The city attorney has to be a resident of the city, et cetera, and basically does away with them and says, well, the city council, you need to have a city attorney, but it removes most of the specifics. And I guess the concern is that, well, maybe they don't even hire a specific. You have to have a city attorney, but maybe they basically hire a law firm or something like that, who in fact gets to make the decision for them. But so again, I'm kind of back at the same place. It's if you sort of say, well, we trust the city council to use their powers reasonably, and if if they don't, we'll have the opportunity to let them know at the time, and we'll have the opportunity to throw them out of office within the next 2 years, as opposed to saying, well, we want to really nail it down and say you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this, and that make sure that they don't overstep those bounds. But on the other hand, it might limit some opportunities and limit some flexibility. For example, I'm not actually. I don't know how common these residency requirements are. For example, for the municipal prosecutor, I'm not sure why. What the actual rationale for that is, but it's there. And if the proposition were adopted, it wouldn't be there.
Dr. Wilson?
Yeah, this is an issue that exists in a variety of cities, although it's a bigger deal in big metropolitan areas, about whether city employment of various types requires city residency. And it becomes a big deal if you're talking about, for example, the police department or fire department of a major city, and you say that to hold this city job, you've got to live within the city limits. This is dealing with a much more narrowly specified set of offices, things like city prosecutor and things like that. Proponents would say that, well, you just want to get the best available person for the job, and it's not so important whether the person lives in Richardson or not, as it is that they're the best qualified to be city prosecutor. The argument on the other side would be that, well, if people are going to be employees of the city, if they're going to be civil servants, then if they live in the community, they have a greater stake in the outcomes for the community. That's kind of what you're weighing here, is the increased flexibility to get the best person for the job in the view of the council, versus the ensuring that whoever holds these city positions actually has a stake in the sense of being a resident as opposed to simply holding a job.
Thank you. Let's go to proposition number 43 about initiative and referendum. Shall sections 14.01, 14.02, 14.03, 14.04, 14.05, 14.06, and 14.08 of the Charter relating to the procedure for a citizen to request an election be called by the City Council for the voters to consider the adoption of an ordinance be amended to clarify and simplify the procedure without making any substantive changes to the existing charter language. Dr. Wilson?
Well, first of all, it's important to point out that initiative and referendum are really two sides of the same coin. They're kind of the inverse of one another, in the sense that initiative is a citizen petition or a citizen drive to force the council to adopt some sort of ordinance, right? To kind of force the council's hand to undertake something that they have not otherwise done. Referendum is the reverse of that, which is trying to force the council's hand to get rid of something that they have done that has been found to be objectionable. But both of these are manifestations of direct democracy. These are ways for the citizens to intervene to correct something that they believe has gone awry in the way that the council is governing the city, right? Either by omission or commission, one or the other. For initiative, we can talk first of all about this one, about this proposition 43. As I see it, the main effect of this proposition would be to specify that if the council adopts an ordinance at the request of a citizen initiative, that the council cannot then subsequently repeal that ordinance, okay? That any repeal of that ordinance would have to be undertaken by a citizen vote, right? That would be at least potentially a sneaky way of getting around the initiative process. So if the council responds to a citizen push for new legislation by saying, sure, we'll pass that, right? Because one acceptable response to a citizen initiative is, in these words, to adopt by the city council, whatever the citizens are pushing for. If they then a couple of months later turned around and simply by a council vote repealed whatever they had enacted, that would be a way of thwarting the initiative. This provision would make that impossible, right? This provision would say that if the council responds to a citizen initiative push by adopting that ordinance, that it could only subsequently be repealed by citizen vote. So it's a way of preserving citizen power in that regard.
Thank you. Dr. Lowry?
Yeah, I mean, so who could possibly object to a proposal that clarifies and simplifies without any substantive changes? But as Dr. Wilson just pointed out, there is at least one big substantive change. And that is important, and he's right that is, it closes off an option for the council. This is another thing that Texas, at the state level, doesn't have initiatives, but quite a few states do. And there's actually been a lot of political science research on this, mostly at the state level. And this is one of the standard tricks that state legislatures use to get around the initiative is the citizens pass a law through the initiative process, and then the legislature just amends it, or gets rid of it altogether. Except some states don't allow that, and there are variations on it. The strongest one would be similar to this, which is once something's passed through an initiative, it simply cannot be amended or rescinded by the council. Something in between, which again isn't really available, is it couldn't be amended until after the next election, so at least you get a chance for some input that way. But this, the potential downside on this is it really does lock those provisions in, because it means the only way to amend or repeal something adopted through an initiative will be going through all of the hoops of organizing another petition drive and getting it on the ballot and doing all of that. And that takes a lot more organization than just having someone consider whether it ought to be amended, if not repealed, in the regular council. So it does on the one hand close off an end run by the council going around the citizens, but on the other hand it makes it very rigid, whatever it is that's adopted.
Thank you. Let's go to proposition number 44, which is also about initiative and referendum. shall Section 14.09 of the Charter be amended to clarify and simplify the procedure for the qualified voters to submit a referendum petition for an election to consider the approval or disapproval of an ordinance adopted by the City Council. Dr. Wilson?
So as I said before, this is kind of the flip side of what we talked about before. The referendum is the flip side of initiative, where a referendum is if a group of citizens objects to something that the council has done, objects to some city ordinance that has been passed. A referendum is an attempt to get it off the books, to remove that bit of legislation. Now, the only key thing to really note here is that there are some actions of the council that are not subject to referendum. And they're not subject to referendum for very good reason. So for example, people can't just vote to repeal all city taxes. Otherwise you'd get those referendum proposals all the time, and you'd essentially have anarchy in municipal government. So things like that, things like tax policy, are shielded not only by the charter but by state law from being subject to the referendum process. So those kind of normal items of business, as you know, ordinances levying taxes, appropriating money, authorizing the issuance of bonds, zoning, those kinds of things that might be real flashpoints for citizen resistance, for thinking, you know, they don't like a zoning decision, they think their taxes are too high. You can't address that sort of thing through referendum. Otherwise, this particular provision does not change the referendum process very much. It just makes a change to the period. So it changes the number of days in which someone could file a referendum petition from a month after the offending ordinance has been passed to basically 6 weeks, 45 days. So it gives citizens a little bit longer to react to a city council ordinance that they find to be objectionable. So in that sense, you know, it makes it a little bit easier by extending that deadline in order to file.
Dr. Lowry?
Yeah, it makes it a little bit easier, and there is one other thing that I think is new, was it gives the secretary 10 days to determine whether the petition signatures are valid, whereas the current language, there's no time limit. It says you have to have 10% of the voters. Now again, you know, I'm thinking, is that important? Well, put on your cynical hat and think of, like, if you were a secretary and you didn't like the idea of this referendum, one thing you could do is just take a really, really long time to verify the signatures. And I don't know if that would really allow you to avoid it altogether, but by saying, you know, you've got 10 days, it sort of structures the process a little bit more. And yeah, that plus the 45 days to collect the signatures, I think makes it easier to use and more likely that you would have successful referendums.
Thank you. Let's go to proposition number 52, which is about the recall of city council members. Shall Article 5 of the Charter relating to the procedures for the recall of a member of the city council be amended to add a new section 5.04 to limit the time period for a resident to file a petition to cause an election to be held to recall the mayor or a council member from office by prohibiting such petition within 1, 6 months after such person's election or appointment to the city council, if such person was appointed, 2, within 3 months after an election for such person's recall, if such person had been the subject of a prior recall election, was not removed from office as a result of such recall election, and did not resign, and 3, within 3 months prior to the expiration of such person's current term of office. Dr. Wilson?
So what this does, of course, is to limit the time frame within which recalls can take place. And the rationale behind this is a couple of things. So first of all, a recall election is expensive, right? There are some costs to the city associated with having a recall election. Moreover, it's stressful and taxing for the council member, whoever is being subjected to it. So the idea here is that while the ability to recall a council member ought to exist in cases of some real concerns about malfeasance or, you know, not showing up for meetings or whatever it may be, that ought to be possible, but this ought not to be a routine nuisance tool that can be used to harass a council member. And so the idea here, if this provision were passed, is that, well, look, if someone has been serving for less than 6 months, can there really, within that very, very limited time frame, already be a basis for recalling the person? Or are you really, if that's what you're doing, just asking for a redo of the election because you don't like the result that you got the first time? And that's really not what the recall procedure is supposed to be used for. Likewise, this is why the second change would be made, is if someone has just been subject to a recall and they're not recalled, you can't turn around and say, well, by God, I'm going to do it again, right, and force them to stand for another recall election. I mean, that would be sort of harassment by recall petition, and this would prohibit that from taking place. And then the idea is, if the person's got less than 3 months left on their term anyway, it's a needless expense for the city to have a recall election when you have an opportunity in less than 90 days to vote that person out anyway. So from my, it's not my business to endorse, tell you which way to vote on this. These, in my opinion, seem like relatively common sense measures for limiting the applicability of the recall provision.
Dr. Lowry?
I would just echo that, yeah.
Okay, all right. Okay, proposition number 67 is about franchises. Shall section 12.03 of the charter be amended to clarify and simplify the existing charter provision relating to the authority of the city to grant a franchise for a public or private utility? Dr. Lowry?
Yeah, so this is yet another one of the proposals that says, let's take out some of the detail and some of the restrictions in the current charter and basically say, you can do something up to the full extent allowed under state law. Specifically, what it would remove is current language that says the franchise cannot be granted until after its third and final reading, which reading shall be at 3 separate regular meetings of the City Council of the City of Richardson, the last of which will take place not less than 30 days from the first. So under the current language, it takes at least 30 days before you can grant, from the time it's first proposed until you can grant a franchise. And again, I don't know if there's any, I assume that same provision is not in the state law. I don't actually know, but that would be removed. And the obvious advantage is if there was a need to move more quickly, one could. If people felt that they didn't want to rush into things, you show up at the council meeting and you say, hey, let's let this, let's think about this a little bit longer. And again, it sort of comes down to, do you want to give the council the discretion to use this up to the extent allowed under state law, knowing that the ultimate check is, the next election, and there's always the opportunity to come to a meeting and argue that, you shouldn't move too quickly on something. And this is another area where I don't know if this has been a problem in the past. There have been instances where things just got dragged out because of this 3 readings requirement and something didn't get done, that should have been done.
Dr. Wilson?
Yeah, I would just say that this comes back to a theme that we've raised over and over and over again with a lot of these provisions. That is that a lot of the proposed amendments to the charter here are aimed at streamlining and making more efficient city government by empowering the council to do what's in their best judgment. Various provisions here, including this one, would remove some of the existing restrictions on how they go about their business. And, basically, if voters trust their elected officials enough to do what's in the best interest of the city, then they'll be inclined, I think, to adopt a lot of these provisions, to say, the city council members know a lot better than we do exactly what's in the best interest of the city, what's, efficient and effective government, and so we trust them to make these decisions. Or alternatively, keeping the current provisions in effect continues to put more specific restrictions on the way they go about doing business. So on some level, it boils down to a question of how much voters want to trust and empower their elected officials to just take care of city business versus how much they want the way that they take care of city business to be carefully constrained and legally channeled.
Thank you, gentlemen. That concludes the category of 3-star propositions, which are the ones that the Richardson League deemed would have the most impact on city government if passed. So now we'll continue with as many 2-star propositions as we can in the time that we are going to allot for that, which is about the next 15 minutes. So we will talk about these 2-star propositions until about 8:15, 8:20. And they're grouped by subject matter. So the first one is, again, about initiative and referendum, and it's proposition number 76. Excuse me. Shall section 14.07 of the charter be amended to change the number of days that an ordinance proposed by initiative petition must be published by the city secretary from 45 days to 30 days? Dr. Wilson?
Yeah, the other thing that this provision does is make some alteration to the medium in which these proposed changes have to appear. So, currently the requirement is that the proposed change would have to be published in both a local newspaper and an official publication of the city. If this is adopted, it says that either would suffice. That is, if it's published either in a local newspaper or in an official publication of the city, that suffices in terms of notification of voters. So, it's not a major change. It makes that slight alteration to how long ahead of time the secretary has to publish the initiative, and then in what format it may be published. In part, this is a response to an increasingly digital age where a lot of these things can appear online and where people aren't necessarily relying on print publications in order for their information about city government. So perhaps the urgency for publication in multiple print formats is not what it would have been even 15 years ago, as more and more people are coming to expect that information about city government will be transmitted digitally.
Thank you, Dr. Lowry.
Yeah, I was actually gonna wonder whether the city website counts as the official publication. If not, then yeah, I agree that given that a lot of this information is available online, there's less need to have it in multiple hard copy versions. And the other thing this does, again, though, is it does only require 30 days notice instead of 45. I'm not sure what the justification for that is, but it would shorten the amount of time that people have to consider this before having to vote on it.
Thank you. Before we go to the next proposition, be sure to raise your hand if you want a card and have a question to ask. Proposition number 10 is about budget and financial procedure. Shall section 11.02 of the charter relating to the preparation of the city budget by the city manager be amended to delete the list of the required contents of the city manager's budget message and provide in lieu thereof that the budget prepared by the city manager will comply with and contain such information as required by state law? Dr. Wilson.
So this is another example of a theme we've talked about before, where this is one of those provisions that eliminates some Richardson-specific requirements and says, look, as long as the government acts in a way that complies with state law, that's fine. So, this is a simplification of what currently exists in the charter. And honestly, I'm not sure exactly what budget components are in fact required by state law. I don't know if you know, Bob, so I'm not sure exactly if this were adopted what that would default to. I don't know what state law requires, but this would say that as long as the budget that is submitted does in fact comply with those state laws, that it would eliminate these Richardson specific requirements in terms of what's contained in the budget message.
I did look briefly at what state law requires. I don't know if I can remember. It obviously a little bit less detailed than the current charter does. I think maybe a little less detail on proposed revenue maybe. But the main point I want to make is that this is, in some sense, is a little bit different, I think, than some of these other proposals that would take away some of the detail and say, we're just going to go with state law. The other proposals take away detail that applies additional restrictions on what the Richardson City Council does. This would take away additional requirements mandating transparency in the budget process. And so, whereas these other proposals we've been talking about give you the council more flexibility to do things, yeah, in a sense, this gives more flexibility, but we're talking about reporting requirements, not taking actual actions on things. And so, again, I kind of wonder what the rationale is for saying we need less transparency, or less transparency would be a good idea. Has there been some difficulty, fulfilling the requirements of the current city charter? Is there some reason why you would want less information made available? I'm just not sure, but I do think this is a little bit different than some of these other proposals we've been talking about.
Okay, the next one is proposition number 12, which is also about budget and financial procedure. Shall section 11.06 of the charter relating to budget appropriation of funds be amended by changing the phrase reserved fund balance to unallocated fund balance to correctly describe the function of such fund consistent with municipal budget and financial practices? Dr. Wilson.
Okay, so this is the part of the charter that essentially requires the balanced budget, right? So this is that, and this is a provision that exists at a lot of state and local, for a lot of state and local governments, where it currently says that estimated expenditures for operating purposes will in no case exceed proposed revenue plus reserved fund balance and other financing sources, right? So your projected expenses cannot exceed your projected revenues. The change in question refers to this term, reserved fund balance. And apparently the concern is that reserved fund balance means something more specific than what's really intended here. That in its common usage, reserved fund balance means a fund balance that was specifically earmarked for some particular purpose. And in this case, what's really meant is just leftover money. And so leftover money is better described as unallocated rather than reserved. And so this wording change would bring the balanced budget requirement in line with that conception of, how you tally up your assets on one side of the equation.
Dr. Bowden.
Yeah, so this is one, when I read it, I said, call an accountant, I'm not one.
Yeah.
But my gut impression is the same as yours, that reserved fund in sort of common vernacular means something that's allocated, in a sense, that it's supposed to be used for a specific purpose. And what we're talking about here is money that's left over. But I think the larger point is that if, whatever the generally accepted accounting standards are, it's a good idea to be in compliance with them. And so if that is the language, however they got there, then that seems like a good thing to do.
Okay, here is another one about budget and financial procedures. Shall section 11.08 of the charter be amended to clarify the existing charter provision that city council may include in the city budget a reasonable sum set aside as an unallocated fund balance to meet unexpected and unforeseen contingencies in the operating costs of each budget fund of the city? Kind of similar to the, did I already read that one?
Proposition 41.
This is
I'm
41.
sorry, it was Proposition 41. I'm sorry.
So this is essentially touching the same issue, right? This use of the term reserved versus unreserved, with the unintended implications of that within accounting and budgeting parlance. And by getting rid of that term unreserved, in the same way that the previous proposition we discussed would get rid of the term reserved, and replacing it with unallocated, I think the attempt here is to bring the discussion more in line with the way that we kind of commonly use and conceptualize those terms. As I read this, it's not really changing anything substantive about the way that city budgeting happens. It's a change in terminology to bring it more in line with the way that we really mean these terms.
Dr. Bowden?
Yeah, I mean, this section, I think that the section is there to clarify that when the budget is adopted, you don't have to commit every penny, that you can hold a little bit back for things that are unforeseen. And whether you call it a reserve fund, a contingency fund, an unallocated balance, a rainy day fund, as long as everybody knows what it is, then the most important thing is to comply with generally acceptable accounting standards. So if that's the terminology, then that makes sense.
Okay. Let's go to Proposition number 24 about the city council.
Oops. 24.
24.
Oh.
Shall Section 3.04 of the Charter relating to the compensation paid to the members of the City Council be amended by increasing the per diem compensation from $50 per meeting to $100 per meeting? Dr. Lowry?
Right, so as I understand it, the current compensation for city council hasn't changed in 20 or 25 years or something like that. So if you took, I actually could have done this if I thought about it, if you took a price index and calculated how much inflation there's been over the last 25 years, I think that $50 a meeting 25 years ago would actually be more than $100 a meeting now. Inflation hasn't been that high, but it'd probably be 110, 120, something like that. So this is basically trying to bring that in line. And more generally, the notion is, well, $50 or even $100 a meeting, considering that that's the only thing council members get paid for. I mean, they get expenses reimbursed, but they don't get paid for all the things they do when not actually meeting as a council. It is reasonable compensation, and again, probably doesn't even quite catch up, adjusting for inflation with 25 years ago. And there is maybe some concern about whether not offering decent compensation limits the kind of people who are willing and able to run for the council. That some people need to work 2 jobs, or at least they're more concerned about take-home money. And you say, well, $50 versus $100, but if you figure a potential of up to 4 meetings a month or a meeting a week, that the difference over the course of a year is $2,600, which is maybe enough to tip somebody's calculations on whether they want to run for the office or not.
Dr. Wilson?
Yeah, offering reasonable compensation for people's time enables people of more moderate means to actually be public servants, as opposed to limiting it to people who are wealthy enough that they just don't care about the compensation. So having reasonable compensation does expand the pool of potential office holders. And I think that one would be hard-pressed to argue that getting compensation of, let's say, $5,000 a year for city council service is a princely sum. Given that, it certainly, in my view at least, does seem like a reasonable increase in compensation to actually account for the fact that this brings it in line in terms of purchasing power with what was intended when this was last put into effect 25 years ago.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to take one more, and this is proposition number 1 about the City Council. Shall Section 3.01A of the Charter be amended to clarify that the City Council consists of 7 members comprised of a mayor and 6 council members, and to add definitions for the words and phrases City Council, council, council member, member of the City Council, and member of the council to ensure consistent application and interpretation throughout the Charter. Dr. Lowry.
Well, this is as far as I can tell, simply a proposal to change the language of the section to take account of the amendment that was made some time ago to now start electing the mayor as a separate office. And so, this is so what happens in direct democracy when you have people making amendments one at a time, and they, single subject matter and all that, they amend one provision of the charter, and it has these ripple effects all the way through. You get other provisions that maybe don't change substantively, but now the language doesn't quite match, or there's some details left out. And so this is an attempt to do this. And the other thing that it does is it really defines terms, right in the very start of the charter, so everybody knows exactly who and what we're talking about. And that can may seem a little bit unnecessary until the first big brouhaha erupts. Because people can't agree over what a term means. So trying to nail down the definitions is probably a way to avoid or limit controversy in the future.
Yeah, this is just sort of a fine linguistic dance that this does here, because according to this provision, the city council includes the mayor, but the mayor is not a council member. So go ahead and figure that out. But it says that for purposes of understanding the charter, that's how we should understand those words. So.
Okay, Gentlemen, we have a question from the audience, and it refers back to our discussion on closed sessions, executive sessions, and it asks, so council members are not banned from answering questions about closed meetings? Is that an ethical problem? No ethical problems?
They're not banned from answering.
It says, so council members are not banned from answering questions about what goes on in closed meetings?
So that is, I guess, if at an open meeting, they were asked a question about something that took place at a closed meeting,
I think that's what they're
Right.
referencing.
what would they be allowed to say?
How
What
much
should
could they say about what went on in closed session?
Well,
Given
I
that
mean,
it's
the
closed.
charter doesn't ban them from responding.
Right.
I don't know if there's a code of ethics for elected politicians, is there? I mean, its standard response is that was a closed meeting and it's confidential. On the other hand, we all know there are leaks. I mean, they usually don't take the form of answers given at open meetings. They take another form. But, certainly they shouldn't respond with anything substantive about what went on at the closed meeting, other than the final result. We decided to hire X or something.
Yeah, I mean, if people are divulging information or positions that were taken at closed meetings, it defeats the purpose of having executive sessions or closed meetings in the first place, right? The reason for allowing such meetings to take place is so that people can speak freely about very sensitive matters. That's why you go into executive session. That's why you might have a closed meeting. If whatever you said is going to be divulged by, let's say, a city council member who may have been on the other side of the issue at the next open meeting, then it really removes the advantages of being able to have a closed meeting in the first place. So I agree with Professor Lowry. There's nothing in the charter that specifically addresses this question. It's really a kind of ethical decision that's incumbent on the council member himself or herself, and how they choose to comport themselves vis-a-vis their colleagues.
And it's really not in the long-term interest of somebody to disclose what was said, at least not in a way that they can be identified as the person who disclosed it. Because the next time you have a closed meeting, who's going to trust them? Or who's even going to have a closed meeting with them? That's why sort of the classic diplomatic phrase for a knockdown, drag-out fight is, we had a full and frank discussion of issues. Next question. But seriously, I mean, so people, but it also means that when information does get out, it tends to take the form of an anonymous leak. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want people to know that you were the one that made the disclosure.
Well, okay, thank you all very much, and let's thank the panelists. They did a great job. They helped make sense out of some rather complicated language in these propositions. And thank you all for being a great audience.
Thank you, Councilman and Councilwoman. And thank you all for being here. I hope this was informative for you. If you have further questions, I'm sure the gentleman will be happy to talk with you. And I hope to see you at the polls.
I do have early voting applications if anybody wants one. I only have them for Dallas County though. We didn't but if you want one of these, you do have to be 65 years old, disabled, be out of the county for the full early election, or the day of voting, or incarcerated with right to vote.
I said it's not. Oh, the state will.
And some of that is very confusing.
You don't think so?
I've been through it. I'm sure. They did a really good job.
They did, I thought they did. So. Thank you for coming.
Because I guess the lunch period, they could not enact.
That's not enough to take an official action.
Yeah,
Unless the committee in effect takes official action by the council rubber stamp for what happens. And it says, in that case, it may be judged that the committee is. Yeah, I mean, that's what the handbook.
Yeah,
But there
yeah.
might be circumstances where the full council has delegated binding authority to a small subset of itself.
The open meetings handbook says rubber stamp.
Okay, they actually use that phrase.
Use that phrase. In that case, they say that it is. But in general, they say committees aren't something. So in this amendment, that moves committees from the requirement to have a full meeting.
Yeah.
It's
It's important, it's an important change, yeah.
Thank you very much. It was very useful.
Y'all answered one very simple question. Why are we voting on 3 different things?
Yeah, well, about